Well, to begin, I'd like to thank Joe for another really enlightening and excellent presentation. I've listened to Joe a number of times and also worked closely with him on several projects, and I've always been impressed with sort of his depth of understanding of the issues. And I think he's one of the more well-read and thoughtful individuals working in the climate change and risk perception area. Yep. Now, Joe's presented some fairly intriguing evidence that our direct experiences of extreme weather events may play an important role in how we understand and respond to climate change. Now, at the risk of oversimplifying Joe's seeing is believing type model, I believe it goes something like this. Now, as I mentioned before, Joe's a deep thinker on this particular issue. I'm less of a deep thinker, so you'll see that my presentation is much simpler than Joe's. So the basic idea of the seeing is believing model is that we have direct experience of an extreme weather event, for example, a bushfire or a flood. That will increase our concern or belief about climate change, and hopefully that concern and belief will translate into some type of an adaptive response. So a very simple causal model that's operating here. Now, as Joe mentioned in his talk, that's only one way to make sense of this particular data. It's quite possible that the direction of causality actually operates in exactly the opposite direction. This is what we call motivated reasoning. So the idea is that we have a pre-existing belief or concern about climate change, and as Joe said, everywhere we look, we see evidence for that pre-existing belief. So this is called motivated reasoning. We actively seek out information to confirm our pre-existing beliefs. Now, the interesting thing about motivated reasoning is that it actually cuts in both directions. You can have people who have this pre-existing belief about climate change, and they will see evidence of climate change when they have a flood or they experience a bushfire. But motivated reasoning also works in the opposite direction. So if you have a pre-existing skepticism or denial of human-induced climate change, you're more likely to discount any evidence that you encounter or attribute it to different factors. So Joe mentioned a number of headlines that he found in the paper that indicated a link between extreme weather events and climate change. Well, here's one headline that goes in exactly the opposite direction coming out of a US paper last week. It's saying extreme weather is not unusual in the United States, despite what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, which is the US agency responsible for monitoring the conditions of the oceans and atmosphere, despite the fact that this US agency is calling it historic, the evidence, according to this news article, is in fact it's nothing out of the ordinary, right? So there's that denial that these things are actually a signal for climate change that's being conveyed in the media. The other thing that people do, if you have a skeptical worldview about climate change, is that you will attribute that climate change to other factors. So some people will say it's just a conspiracy, Al Gore. Other people will say, well, that the measures are wrong. You've got all these temperature sensors that are closer to sort of the centers of major cities, and of course cities are hotter than outlying areas, so the fact that our cities are expanding, that's causing the temperatures to rise. Other people say that, it's just greedy academics who need more grant money that are somehow skewing the data to say that, things are warming up when in fact there's been no change over time. So again, the main thing here is that motivated reasoning can work in two directions. Now, Joe also mentioned this very interesting study that just came out a couple of months ago in Nature by Myers, looking at the relationship between experiential learning and motivated reasoning. So the idea is that we've got two plausible explanations about how people might make sense of their direct experiences. In this particular case, they had a longitudinal study, longitudinal data, as Joe mentioned, 2008 and 2011, nationally representative US sample, and their main finding was that there was evidence in support of both the experiential learning model and also the motivated reasoning model. And as Joe mentioned, it seemed that motivated reasoning was more important for a certain group of individuals, those individuals who were highly engaged with climate change. So we have two types of highly engaged types of individuals who are very interested in this climate change issue. We have alarmed individuals And when they have direct experience with climate change, this really has very little impact on their pre-existing views. They just take it as evidence that climate change is indeed occurring. So when they experience a climate change event, it may not transform them in any important way. It's just used as additional evidence for their pre-existing beliefs. Highly skeptical individuals also tend to be highly engaged in this issue. And when they experience a climate event, again, this direct experience may have very little impact on their beliefs and concern about climate change. Again, their concern would remain low despite these experiences. But it's this group here, it's this less engaged group. It's a very interesting group, and I think it's an important group because in the Meyer study, they found that that consisted of 75% of their sample. So these are the individuals that seem to be influenced by their climate change experiences. If they experience an extreme weather event, they actually treat that as a learning experience, a potentially transformative experience where that leads to increased concern and increased belief that climate change is actually occurring. So the main thing here is that direct experience doesn't affect everyone in exactly the same way. If you're a highly engaged individual, you take it as evidence for your pre-existing beliefs. If you're a less engaged individual, you take this information on board and become more concerned about the issue. Now, the second thing that struck me as I read the draft of Joe's paper is that there were a lot of similarities between direct experience with extreme weather events and another area that I do research in, which is related to fear appeals. So, just looking at the similarities between the model. So the simple seeing as believing model, you have a direct experience, that increases your concern, and that increases your motivation to take some type of protective action. A fear appeal model is essentially the same thing, but instead of having a direct experience, you're having an indirect experience through some type of threat message that's often created by a government agency, community service organization. That threat message is specifically designed to elicit fear, make people afraid of the potential threat, and when people become more afraid, they become, according to the model, more motivated to take protective action. Okay. Now, so you can think of an extreme weather event as sort of this type of fear appeal. But it's not a fear appeal that's developed by a marketing agency. It's sort of a fear appeal that comes from nature. It's sort of nature's way of saying, you know, something important is happening here. You might want to take notice. Now, so, question that I ask myself, is there anything that we can learn from the fear appeals literature to better understand the direct experience effects that Joe was talking about and transform extreme weather events into teachable moments that can help individuals and communities adapt more effectively to climate change? Okay, so before we get into that, the first question is, are fear appeals actually effective? Do they work? Well, messages designed to elicit fear can be a very effective strategy to change behavior, but it turns out only under specific conditions. Threat messages that focus exclusively on raising fear often elicit defensive reactions, which we call fear control processing. People are less focused on dealing effectively with the threat. They're more concerned with keeping their fear under control. This leads to things such as avoiding the message, rejecting the message, or denying that the threat is a significant threat to them. Now, these are some of the specific conditions under which fear appeals can actually work and be much more effective. First of all, in order for a fear appeal to work, not only do you have to elicit fear, but you have to make sure that the audience believes that the threat is actually relevant to them. And it seems to me, with direct experience at least, they're right in the midst of it, so in most cases the threat would be considered to be relevant. Second, the message needs to include specific advice about how the audience can minimize or avoid the threat. Third, the audience has to be convinced that the recommended actions will be effective in reducing the threat. This is something that we call response efficacy. And finally, the audience needs to be convinced that they can successfully engage in the recommended actions. This is something that we call self-efficacy. Right, so in order for fear appeals to work, you have to raise the level of fear, but at the same time, you also have to raise the level of efficacy, so people are confident that they can effectively deal with the threat. Okay, so what are the implications here for the seeing as believing model? So we have some evidence that direct exposure to extreme weather events, natural disasters, will increase concern and fear. And in Joe's own data, there's a lot of strong emotional content related to people's exposure to these types of problems. But just because we can have an experience that increases our concern or fear, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the next step into increasing motivation to take protective action will actually go forward. The key component in order to get that second link in the chain to happen is to increase efficacy. So here's a slightly modified model based on fear appeal literature, and in particular, Witt's model of parallel process model of risk perception. So essentially, we can have people going down two roads. They have a direct experience with a threat, and they feel fear and concern. If for some reason, because of their personal constitution or some type of intervention that was introduced to boost efficacy, they'll tend to take protective action. If, on the other hand, you have a direct experience with the threat, fear and concern levels increase substantially, but there is a low level of efficacy, people will tend to deny the effect or avoid the threat. So the idea is that if you need to get people to adapt in an effective manner to the climate change threat, not only do you have to alert them that this is a very, very serious issue, but you also have to provide them with the tools to deal with that issue in an effective way. All right, just to finish up here, just a few possible avenues for future research. Some of these Joe have already discussed. First of all, what are the key differences between directly experiencing a climate event and indirectly experiencing the same event through the media or word of mouth? Are the effects of these two types of experiences qualitatively different? So Joe was talking about the power of direct experience to lead to transformational change. Given the advances in technology with internet, multimedia, can we elicit those same types of transformational change using other types of media? Or do people really need to have to be right in the middle of it, in these life-threatening situations, in order to go through those change events? Second, what are the most effective strategies for building individual and collective self-efficacy to effectively adapt to climate change? And are there different strategies that are required for different segments in the population? So as I mentioned before, there are people who are truly now alarmed about climate change, and those people that are skeptical, and some people that just don't care one way or the other. If you're going to try to provide people with skills to deal with this particular threat, do you need to come up with different types of interventions for each of those subgroups? Finally, what is the impact of repeated exposures to extreme weather events? So for example, you just experienced a major flood event over the last week, but you also experienced something very similar in 2011. What is the impact of cumulative exposure on fear, concern, self-efficacy, and motivation to take protective action? And what can be done to increase the resilience of individuals and communities facing ongoing threats? So the idea here is that, if you had a terrible experience in 2011, does that impact the way that you cope in 2013? Or if you had a successful, if you engaged successfully with the threat in 2011, does that give you a higher level of efficacy and self-confidence to deal with that threat in 2013? thank you very much. That's all I've had, so I'll wrap it up here. Yep.